Alright, welcome back to Hoop Hierarchy. This is KC returning with another video in the ranking all number one overall picks by their careers video series. So, today's video is going to be over players who were drafted from 1981 to 1990. This should be a pretty interesting list. I think there was a good mix of really solid players and some players that kind of disappointed. But for people who haven't seen this series before, this is a series where I'm taking all the players from the beginning of the NBA draft and ranking them on how well they did throughout their NBA career. I'm not doing any deep dives on any of these guys. I'm just kind of giving a kind of a miniature encapsulation of how their career went and how it ended up in general compared to the hype that was behind said player. The tiers are going to be as follows. So S tier is a top tier elite player that exceeded all expectations. A would be a guy who probably won a few All-Star games. You're not disappointed that you had him, but you're not really blown away with the performances he had either throughout his career. He just kind of lived up to that number one overall spot. B is an acceptable player, but a minor letdown for the pick he was selected at. C is a solid-ish, probably a role player, but definitely a disappointment for a number one. And F is a player who is generally not very good and was a huge disappointment for that number one overall pick. But now that we have laid out the ground rules for that, I'm going to get right into it with the number one overall pick in the 1981 season. And that was Mark Aguirre. So, Mark Aguirre is a name that many people know. He had a great career at DePaul. He led them to a solid playoff push into the Final Four in 1979, and then afterwards he went into the NBA and played for the Dallas Mavericks. As a Mavs player, he was their number one scorer and part of some good but underachieving Mavs teams. Numbers-wise, he took a step down, moving to Detroit in 1988-89, but he did earn himself two championships there. Aguirre was a great player and a key cog in two championship rosters, but to me, he is not quite in the class of other S-tier guys. However, as a two-time All-Star and a consistently good player, he probably met the expectations going number one throughout his career, at least statistically, and how he performed. So by no means do I think Mark Aguirre was a disappointment. I'm going to say A tier for him. Next up, we have James Worthy. So, Big Game James, as he was known, was the leading scorer and one of the best college basketball teams of all time. On a roster including Sam Perkins and Michael Jordan, he led that team in scoring. He made a clutch steal to win the NCAA championship that year as well. So, luckily for James, he didn't have to go to a bad team going number one overall, as the Lakers, who had just won the championship the year before, paid off the league to get the pick. No, okay, just kidding on that, obviously. But no, really, they just traded some guy named Don Ford for the Cavs' first rounder 3 years before, and the Cavs ended with the worst record that season, so the Lakers won the coin flip for the number one overall pick. Obviously huge for the Lakers because James Worthy made himself into the perfect running mate for Magic, turning that championship team into what became a dynasty. James Worthy ended up being a three-time champion, Finals MVP 1 year, seven-time All-Star, averaging close to 20 for his career, and being one of the best defenders in the league throughout his career. It is really hard for me not to classify him as S tier because that's what I believe his impact was on the NBA. So yeah, James Worthy is going to be S tier for me. Next up is Ralph Sampson. So, Ralph is a guy I talked about just a little bit recently in my deep dive on Victor Wembanyama video that I made. Simply due to the fact that he's basically Wembanyama before Wembanyama was a thing. Ralph, like Victor, had heavy expectations coming into the NBA as a 7'4 center who had elite level of mobility and agility for his size. He was completely dominant on the inside at the college level on both the offensive and defensive ends. He opened up his rookie year strongly, averaging 21 and 11 for Houston, and then Houston decided to go with Hakeem Olajuwon in the next draft. This formed the Twin Towers in Houston. Some people were skeptical of the fit, and others thought it would be one of the greatest front courts ever. So there was a wide range of opinions on them as a duo. After one season, it worked really well. Sampson averaged 22 and 10, and they were good as a team. There was one more good season after that, but then Sampson kind of fell to injury issues. His game tanked. His stats got gradually worse. He eventually fell out of favor with Houston and bounced around the league for a couple years on a few different teams. I think he could have been an all-time great at center, but that extreme height that he had, along with probably just a propensity to get injured, probably played into his injury problems later in his career. Really pretty early on in his career. It was a very short-lived NBA career, especially for what he looked like he could have been. He was good for a short while, but definitely a letdown for where the hype level was for him. So I'm going to go B tier for Ralph Sampson. Next up, another center drafted by the Rockets, Hakeem Olajuwon. So, kind of what I mentioned in Ralph Sampson's section. This was kind of the running mate duo that Houston wanted to go with. And Hakeem better lived up to the lofty expectations of that first overall pick. You know, he came to play for Houston in college from Nigeria. Initially not a major recruit whatsoever. Did not play big minutes until his redshirt sophomore year. After spending that summer working out with Moses Malone in a bid to improve his game and his playing time, it obviously worked. He was picked number 1 overall by Houston and became one of the greatest big men of all time. He immediately averaged 20 and 12 as a rookie. He had some absurd statistical seasons where he was probably the best defensive player in the NBA and all time, realistically, and a force on the offensive end as well. Along with earning 2 championships and an MVP in the mid-90s, people say maybe Houston regrets passing on Jordan, but most people you ask who are Houston fans say they don't really regret Hakeem at all. And if you're a guy taken ahead of Jordan and your team doesn't necessarily regret doing it, you're pretty much immediately deserving of S tier. And so that's what I think Hakeem is. I think he is definitely an S tier guy, all-time great, deserves that spot. Next up is Patrick Ewing, one of the most successful college bigs of all time. If you mention Georgetown basketball, the first thing that comes to mind is Patrick Ewing, at least for me. In dominating college basketball for his whole college career, he set himself up incredibly well to be the easy pick at number 1. Was the actual lottery here rigged, as everyone seems to think? Probably, but that's neither here nor there because Ewing ended up a Knick regardless. Throughout his NBA career, he was one of the premier bigs in the NBA, averaging well over 20 and 10 throughout his prime years, becoming a 11-time All-Star and a 1-time first-team All-NBA. While he never won a championship, he was the centerpiece of one of the best Knicks teams of all time, and I think he more than lived up to the expectations of the number 1 S tier for Patrick Ewing as well. Next up is Brad Daugherty. So, considered an all-time great at the University of North Carolina, Daugherty joined North Carolina as a 16-year-old and developed to a 20-point-per-game scorer as a senior. This translated into being the number 1 overall selection by the Cleveland Cavs, where they basically formed their entire roster in one offseason, taking Daugherty number 1, getting Ron Harper number 8, trading for Mark Price, and then obtaining another rookie in Hot Rod Williams. Daugherty, Harper, and Williams were all named to the all-rookie team that year, and they formed a really pretty decent core for a while that was competitive in the East, never quite living up to, obviously, the Michael Jordan teams with the Bulls. But they gave some good games to those teams, this Cavs team was probably one of the better Cavs teams until LeBron came around. So there's credit to them for that. Daugherty averaged 19 and 10 through 8 seasons, but he ended up with pretty serious back issues that retired him at age 28. So, did not have a long career in the NBA. He was a 5-time All-Star. Like I said, though his career was shorter than you'd hope, he is still deserving, in my opinion, of A tier. Next up is David Robinson. So, one of the more underrated true superstars of the 90s, Robinson was one of the more unexpected superstars of recent memory as well. So basically, he was 5'9" as a junior in high school, always planning on joining the Navy like his father. He grew over the summer into his senior year, going to 6'6", which is pretty incredible realistically, and he had never played organized basketball before, but because of his growth spurt, his high school coach decided to tell him to try out. When he played, he was good. He earned all area honors for the high school he played for, but he did not garner that much college interest. He still went on to play for Navy, which is what he had always planned on to do to begin with. They had a height limit of 6'6" for midshipmen in the Navy, and he was 6'7" at this point, but they decided to grant him a waiver because they thought he was done growing. He was not. He continued to grow to be 7 foot, and this prevented him from actually serving on Navy ships, but it did not prevent him from becoming the best player in Navy history. Due to his college career, he was drafted #1 overall by the Spurs, even though they had to wait for him to finish his 2 years of service. The wait was well worth it. I don't think they're too worried about how long they had to wait for him, as when he did finally make it to the league, he did not disappoint. In his first season, he averaged 24-12 with 4 blocks and stayed dominant for a decade. He won an MVP, 2 championships, 10-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA first team. I think there's no question he's also an S-tier player. So next up we have Danny Manning. So considered one of the best college basketball players of all time, really. Danny Manning scored almost 3,000 points for Kansas over his career. He was as good of a college player as there ever was, and basically willed the Jayhawks to a championship in 1988 with a team that was 21-11, so not spectacular. In the championship, he scored 31, got 18 boards, 5 steals, 2 blocks. He earned that #1 overall pick. Unfortunately, he went to the Clippers, who in the 90s were a bit of a joke of a franchise, and he only had 1 season over 500 his whole career. He also was quite injury prone too, so while he did put up pretty good stats for the games he played, he was injured a lot, and the stats he put up were empty in a sense that his team was bad. So he was just kind of the empty stats guy for the Clippers. So a fine player. Probably would have done better or been considered in a better light if he played on a better team, but not what he was expected to live up to be in any case. So B tier for Danny Manning. Next up is Pervis Ellison. So Pervis Ellison was considered a clutch player that led Louisville to an NCAA championship. He was nicknamed Never Nervous Pervis for his big game performances in college, but when he made it to the NBA, he gained the new, but much more funny, out-of-service Pervis nickname because he was hurt a ton. He was consistently hurt and played a very low number of games per season for his whole career, except 1 year where he showed that what he could have been if it was not for the injuries, where he won Most Improved Player, averaging 20 and 11. Everything other than that was pretty bad, though, and he is considered one of the biggest busts in the more modern era of the draft. I'm gonna say F tier for Pervis Ellison. He just did not live up to the hype that he was supposed to. And finally, Derrick Coleman. So, Derrick Coleman, a highly regarded incoming player. Coleman was supposed to be one of the next generation of great power forwards in the NBA. He played for Syracuse. Legendary Syracuse coach Jim Boeheim says that Coleman is the most influential basketball player in the history of Syracuse. So that, in my opinion, that is a big deal. That says a lot about how good he was as a college player. After his college career, he was named the Big East Player of the Year in his final season. He then went pro to try to live up to some of that hype he had garnered. He unfortunately was unable to do so. He had a good first few years, but like a lot of the bust-type guys before him, he ended up having a lot of injury issues. He averaged 20 for the first 5 seasons of his career, but then he started to get hurt much more often, and then his stats gradually went down as a result. Coleman was another player who was decent but did not live up to the #1 overall pick status, so he is going to be B tier for me. So that comes to the end of this video. For anyone who stuck around up until now, I appreciate you watching. I thought this was a pretty interesting tier list. You've got a pretty wide margin of guys who are in this top tier that lived up to what they were supposed to be. But then you've got a few guys who didn't quite, and then you've got Pervis Ellison who absolutely did not. So it's an interesting way that this list ended up being structured as opposed to some of the last lists. But, you know, sometimes that's just how it shakes out. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, like and subscribe, and I will continue to be putting out more content like this in the future. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this one.